This 1920 portrait holds a secret that no one has ever been able to solve until now. The basement archive of the Greenwood County Historical Society smells of old paper and dust. James Mitchell, a 38-year-old family history researcher from Chicago, carefully looks through a leather-bound ledger recording property transfers from 1920 Mississippi. He has been searching land records for a client all morning, finding only ordinary transactions. At 4:30, with the archive about to close, James reaches for one last box labeled Miscellaneous Personal Effects, 1918 to 1925. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, he finds a pile of photographs damaged by time and humidity. Then he sees it. The photograph is surprisingly well preserved, mounted on thick cardboard. The studio stamp reads Crawford Photography, Greenwood, Mississippi, March 1920. It shows a formal family portrait. A black couple sits in the center, dignified in their finest clothes. The man wears a pressed dark suit, his expression steady and proud. The woman's hands rest gently in her lap, her dark dress perfect, her eyes meeting the camera with quiet strength. 3 children stand with them. 2 girls about 8 and 10 years old wear white dresses with ribbons in their carefully braided hair. But it's the 3rd child that makes James stop cold. Between the 2 girls stands a boy of about 7. His skin is pale. His hair is light brown and wavy. Even in the sepia tones, his eyes are clearly light-colored. The boy is unmistakably white. James leans closer, looking at every detail. The boy stands naturally, the man's hand resting protectively on his shoulder. There's no awkwardness, no forced arrangement. He belongs there. James turns the photograph over. In faded pencil it says, Samuel, Clara, Ruth, Dorothy, and Thomas. March 14th, 1920. He takes a picture with his phone and copies the names into his notebook. His mind races. In 1920 Mississippi, during Jim Crow segregation, a black family with a white child would have been impossible, dangerous, potentially deadly. James approaches the archivist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson. "Do you know anything about this family?" he asks, showing her the photograph. Mrs. Patterson studies it, something flickering across her face. Recognition, perhaps memory. "That would be Samuel and Clara Johnson," she says quietly. "Respected family. He was a carpenter. She took in sewing. And the children," she hesitates. "I've heard stories, old stories, the kind people don't talk about anymore." She glances at the clock. "If you want to understand that photograph, talk to Evelyn Price. She's 93, lives at Magnolia Gardens. Her mother knew the Johnsons." Mrs. Patterson lets James keep the photograph. Nobody's claimed it in 70 years. Maybe it's time someone figured out what it means. Walking to his car, James looks at the 5 faces again. 4 makes sense. 1 is impossible. Whatever happened in 1920, someone went to great lengths to hide it. This photograph is evidence of something extraordinary, something dangerous. Tomorrow he'll visit Evelyn Price. Tonight he'll begin researching. The mystery has taken hold of him, an untold story waiting to be discovered, a truth hidden for 100 years. In his hotel room that evening, James opens his laptop and starts searching. He begins with the 1920 census for Greenwood, Mississippi. He quickly finds Samuel Johnson, age 32, black carpenter, homeowner. Clara Johnson, age 29, seamstress. 2 daughters, Ruth, age 10, and Dorothy, age 8. 2 daughters, no son, no Thomas. James tries birth records next, searching for any Thomas born in LaFleur County between 1912 and 1914. He finds several, but cross-referencing shows they're all accounted for in their own families. None disappeared into a black family's photograph. He emails his research assistant in Chicago. "Need death records for LaFleur County, 1918 to 1920. White couples dying within months of each other, especially with young children. Also, age records." They told people he was Clara's nephew from up north visiting. A mixed-race child passing for white. Barely believable, but people didn't look close if you gave them a story. Our community knew the truth. The black community protected them. We all kept the secret. For how long? Almost 2 years. They called him Thomas. He played with Ruth and Dorothy, went to church, learned carpentry from Samuel. "Sweet boy," my mother said. James looks at the photograph with new understanding. Why risk taking this picture? Samuel wanted proof. If they were caught, arrested, or killed, he wanted evidence the boy existed, that he was loved, part of a family. He saved money for months. The photographer, Albert Crawford, was white but fair-minded. Samuel told him the truth. Crawford could have turned them in. Instead, he took the picture and charged half price. Said it was the bravest thing he'd ever seen. What happened to Thomas? Evelyn's expression saddens. By 1922, it was too dangerous. He looked obviously white as he grew. The Klan was active that year. Threats, violence. Clara had a cousin in Chicago named Diane Porter, married to a white man, a union organizer. They sent Thomas north in June 1922. Clara cried for days. Did they stay in contact? Secret letters for years. Thomas wrote when he was older, said he remembered them, was grateful. After Samuel died in 1935, the letters stopped. Ruth burned them after Clara passed in 1947, thought it was safer. Evelyn hands back the photograph. It's time the story was told. Samuel and Clara risked everything to save a child who wasn't theirs. Didn't look like them in a time when that could have gotten them killed. Find Thomas's family. Tell them what happened. Make sure people know that even in the darkest times, some chose love over fear. James promises he will. Mount Zion Baptist Church still stands on Elm Street, a modest brick building with a white steeple. James arrives Tuesday afternoon and meets Patricia Lewis, the church secretary. I'm researching the Johnson family from the 1920s, James explains. Patricia's eyes widen. Samuel and Clara? Let me get Pastor Williams. Pastor Marcus Williams, a tall man in his 50s, studies the photograph James shows him. His expression grows serious when he notices Thomas. He and Patricia exchange a glance. Follow me, the pastor says quietly. He leads James to the church basement archive, shelves lined with record books and documents. Pastor Williams pulls out a ledger marked 1918 to 1925. We've kept detailed records since 1912. The reverend in the 1920s was Walter Thompson, meticulous about documentation. He also kept private pastoral notes about sensitive matters. Williams opens the ledger, turning pages carefully. Here, March 1920. He points to an entry. Samuel and Clara Johnson with daughters Ruth and Dorothy and Ward Thomas, age 6. Family portrait commissioned. May God protect them in their righteous undertaking. And Ward? James says. That's significant. Reverend Thompson knew. James feels tears on his cheeks. Pastor Williams's eyes are wet too. This stays in our archive, Williams says firmly, but you have my permission to tell this story. The world needs to know what Samuel and Clara Johnson did. Back in Chicago, James dives into city records searching for Diane Porter. He starts with the 1920 census, looking for black women named Diane married to white men on the South Side. He finds her, Diane Porter, age 26, married to James Porter, age 29, occupation union organizer, address 4732 South Indiana Avenue. The 1930 census shows them still at the same address, now with 2 children of their own, and a third child listed as nephew, Thomas Hayes, age 16. There he is, Thomas Hayes, hiding in plain sight in the census records, listed as a nephew. James searches for Thomas Hayes in Chicago through the decades. The trail is faint. He seemed to live quietly, avoiding attention. But James finds a marriage license from 1935. Thomas Hayes married to Anna Schmidt, occupation carpenter like Samuel had been. James searches death records. Thomas Hayes died in 1987 in Evanston, Illinois, age 73. Anna died in 1995. They had 3 children, Robert Hayes, born 1937, Margaret Hayes, born 1939, and Elizabeth Hayes, born 1942. James's heart races. 3 children who would now be in their 80s, possibly still alive, possibly with children and grandchildren of their own, who know nothing about their family's true history. He searches for Robert Hayes first, the eldest son. Property records show Robert owned a home in Oak Park until 2015 when it was sold. James finds an obituary. Robert Hayes died peacefully at age 78, survived by his wife Susan, 3 children, and 7 grandchildren. The obituary lists the children, Michael Hayes, Jennifer Hayes, and Thomas Hayes Jr., another Thomas, named after his grandfather. James searches social media and finds Thomas Hayes Jr., a middle-aged man living. Hago works as a high school history teacher. His Facebook profile is public, showing photos of his family, posts about social justice, pictures from a recent trip to Mississippi for civil rights historical sites. Thomas Hayes Jr. arrives exactly on time, a tall man in his late 40s with graying hair, warm eyes, and an open, intelligent face. He's dressed casually and carries a worn leather messenger bag. They shake hands and sit down. "I'll be honest, Mr. Mitchell," Thomas says. "I'm skeptical but curious. My family history has always been a mystery. Grandpa Thomas died when I was 10. He was a quiet man, kind, but never talked about his past. Just said his childhood was difficult and he preferred to look forward, not back." James opens his folder and carefully removes the 1920 photograph. He slides it across the table. "This is your grandfather," he says, pointing to the young white boy. "Age 6 or 7, March 1920, Greenwood, Mississippi." Thomas stares at the photograph, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. These people are a black family. Samuel and Clara Johnson with their daughters Ruth and Dorothy, and your grandfather Thomas Hayes. I don't understand." James tells him everything. He starts with finding the photograph, moves through Evelyn's testimony, shows him the church records, explains about the fire that killed Robert and Margaret Hayes, describes the orphanage and what would have happened to a 6-year-old boy sent there. Thomas listens, his face growing more emotional with each revelation. When James finishes, there's a long silence. "My grandfather was raised by a black family," Thomas finally says, his voice thick, "in Mississippi in 1920, for almost 2 years. Samuel and Clara Johnson risked their lives and their daughters' lives to save him from that orphanage. They hid him, protected him, loved him. Then, when it became too dangerous, they sent him to Clara's cousin Diane in Chicago, which is how he ended up." Thomas stares at the photograph, tears running down his face. "He never told us. Why wouldn't he tell us?" "Maybe shame," James says gently. "Or maybe protection. Even decades later, in the 1960s and 70s, when your grandfather was raising his family, racial tensions were intense. Maybe he thought this story would bring trouble. Or maybe he was protecting Samuel and Clara's memory. Or maybe," James pauses, "maybe it hurt too much to talk about. He lost his birth parents in a fire, then lost his adopted parents when he was 8. That's a lot of loss for a child." Thomas wipes his eyes. He reaches for the photograph with shaking hands. James hands it to him. Thomas studies every detail. Samuel's protective hand on young Thomas's shoulder, Clara's steady gaze, the 2 girls flanking him. "They saved him," Thomas whispers. "They saved my grandfather, which means they saved all of us. My father, me, my children. None of us would exist if not for their courage. That's right." Thomas looks up. "Are there descendants of the Johnson family?" "I believe so. I haven't traced them yet. I wanted to find you first. But Ruth and Dorothy both had children. There's a family tree out there that connects to yours through the years 1920 to 1922 through love instead of blood." Thomas sets the photograph down carefully. "Mister, I need to tell my family, my siblings, my cousins. We need to know this story." He takes a deep breath. "And I want to find the Johnson descendants. I want to thank them somehow for what their ancestors did. I was hoping you'd say that." They talk for 2 more hours. James shows Thomas every document, every piece of evidence. Thomas asks questions, takes photos, makes notes. He's a historian by training and profession. He wants to understand everything, verify everything, make sense of this revelation that has rewritten his family's story. As they prepare to leave, Thomas grips James's hand firmly. Thank you for finding this, for caring enough to track it down, for bringing this to me. It's the most important thing I've ever learned about my family." James returns to his research with renewed purpose. He needs to find the descendants of Ruth and Dorothy Johnson, the 2 girls in the photograph who grew up knowing they had briefly shared their home with a white boy their parents saved. He starts with Ruth, the older daughter. In the 1930 census, Ruth Johnson, age 20, still lives with her parents in Greenwood. But by 1940, she's gone, likely married. James searches marriage records for Leflore County, 1930 to 1940. He finds it. Ruth Johnson married William Crawford in 1933. Crawford, the same name as the photographer who took the 1920 portrait. James digs deeper and finds the connection. William Crawford was Albert Crawford's son. The photographer who documented the Johnson family's courage had a son who fell in love with Ruth Johnson and married her. They had 4 children: Albert Jr., named after Ruth's mother, Samuel, named after Ruth's father, and Mary. James traces them forward. Clara Crawford, born 1937, married Jerome Washington in 1958 and moved to Memphis. They had 3 children, including a daughter named Ruth Washington, born 1962. James finds Ruth Washington on social media. She's 63, a retired teacher living in Memphis, posts frequently about family, church, and civil rights history. He sends her a message similar to the one he sent Thomas Hayes Jr., explaining that he's discovered an extraordinary story about her great-grandparents. Ruth Washington responds within hours. My grandmother Ruth told me stories when I was young about something secret. My great-grandparents did something brave. She said I'd understand when I was older, but she died before she could tell me. Is this about that? James arranges to call her. When they speak, he tells her everything, shows her the photographs and documents via video call. Ruth Washington listens with her hand and over her mouth, tears streaming. They saved a white child, she whispers, in Mississippi in 1920. Oh my Lord. Your grandmother Ruth knew him. She was 10 years old when he came to live with them. She would have remembered everything. Of course I'm willing. This is everything my grandmother hoped for. I think she wanted this story told. She wanted people to know what her parents did. James then searches for Dorothy's descendants. Dorothy Johnson married Marcus Lewis in 1935, moved to Chicago during the Great Migration in 1942. They had 5 children, and one of them, Patricia Lewis, born 1945, still lives in Chicago. James realizes with a start Patricia Lewis, the church secretary at Mount Zion Baptist Church who helped him find the church records. She's a descendant of the Johnson family. She already knew parts of the story. She's been protecting it, preserving it, waiting for the right moment. James calls Pastor Williams. You knew, he says. You're Dorothy's grandson. I am, Williams confirms. My grandmother Dorothy told my mother everything before she died, and my mother told me. We've been waiting for someone to put all the pieces together, someone from outside who could tell this story properly. Why didn't you tell me immediately? Because the story needed to be discovered, not handed over. You found the photograph, you tracked down Evelyn, you connected the dots. That gives it authenticity, makes it real. If we just told you, it might have seemed like family legend, exaggeration. This way, you verified everything independently. James understands. Thomas Hayes Jr. wants to meet the family. Ruth Washington in Memphis too. Then we'll make that happen, Pastor Williams says. We'll bring everyone together. The descendants of Samuel and Clara Johnson and the descendants of the boy they saved. This is what my great-grandparents would have wanted. 3 months later, on a warm Saturday in June, 2 families gather at Baptist Church in Greenwood, Mississippi. Ruth Washington has come from Memphis with her 3 children and 2 grandchildren. Pastor Marcus Williams is there with his extended family, 7 descendants of Dorothy Johnson. Other Johnson family members have traveled from across the country, nearly 30 people in total. And Thomas Hayes Jr. has brought his entire family, his 2 sisters, his children, his cousins, his nieces and nephews, 23 people who carry the blood of the boy Samuel and Clara Johnson saved in 1920. The church sanctuary is full. Media is not invited. This is private, sacred. James Mitchell stands at the front with Pastor Williams. Between them, displayed on a large screen, is the 1920 photograph. Samuel, Clara, Ruth, Dorothy, and young Thomas. Ruth Washington then shares stories her grandmother Ruth told her, memories of young Thomas playing with her and Dorothy, learning carpentry from Samuel, helping Clara in the garden. My grandmother said Thomas was shy at first, traumatized by losing his parents. But slowly, over months, he began to smile again, to laugh. She said Clara would hold him and sing to him, and Samuel taught him to measure wood and use tools. They loved him like their own. She pauses. And when they had to send him away, when it became too dangerous, my grandmother said her mother cried for weeks. Clara never stopped thinking about him, wondering if he was safe, if he was happy. She kept hoping for letters, for news, and she got some secretly for years until the letters stopped. Thomas Hayes Jr. stands again. I have something to share. He pulls out a box he's brought with him. When my grandfather died, we found this in his attic. We never knew what it meant, but now we do." He opens the box. Inside is a small wooden toy, a carved horse worn smooth by time and handling. "Samuel Johnson made this for my grandfather. We know because there's a tiny SJ carved under the base. My grandfather kept it his entire 73 years. He kept this toy, kept this connection to the family who saved him." He hands the toy to Pastor Williams. "This belongs in your family's history. It's proof that he never forgot them, just as they never forgot him." The two families mingle, share stories, embrace strangers by blood but connected by a bond stronger than genetics. The bond of sacrifice and love across the color line in one of America's darkest times. James watches it all, documenting with photos and notes, witnessing history correcting itself. After the gathering, Thomas Hayes Jr. and Pastor Marcus Williams hold a press conference outside the church. The story has leaked. Too many people knew about the reunion, and now journalists from across the country have descended on Greenwood. Thomas speaks to the cameras. "In 1920, my grandfather Thomas Hayes lost his parents in a fire. He was 6 years old, alone, and about to be sent to an abusive orphanage. A black family named Johnson took him in, and protected him, and loved him at tremendous risk to themselves. Today, our families reunited to honor that act of courage." He holds up the 1920 photograph. This picture was taken as evidence, as proof that a child existed and mattered. Samuel and Clara Johnson wanted the world to know that they had loved this boy, even if it cost them everything. 100 years later, their wish has come true. Thomas Hayes Jr., now in his 60s, speaks at schools and churches, telling his grandfather's story and the Johnson sacrifice. "My grandfather lived because two people cared more about a child's life than their own safety," he says. "That's the America I want to build, where we see each other's humanity first, where we take risks for each other, where love overcomes fear." The Johnson descendants carry their ancestors' legacy with pride. Ruth Washington's granddaughter, studying social work, says, "I'm not surprised Samuel and Clara did what they did. When I look at their photograph, I see it in their eyes, strength, compassion, determination. They raised their daughters to have those same qualities. It's in our family, passed down." 5 years after the reunion, the families gather again, this time for a happier occasion. Thomas Hayes Jr.'s daughter Sarah is marrying Marcus Williams III, Pastor Williams's grandson. The wedding takes place at Mount Zion Baptist Church, where Samuel and Clara worshipped, where Reverend Thompson documented their courage, where two families reunited after a century. The church is decorated with photographs spanning generations. Samuel and Clara with young Thomas in 1920, Thomas Hayes as an adult with his wife and children, the Johnson descendants through the decades. And now this moment, two families join not just by history but by love. "You gave us back our history," Ruth says. "We always knew Samuel and Clara were special, but we didn't know the full story. Now we do. Now the world does." As the evening ends, the knees gather for a photograph. Dozens of descendants of both families stand together where Samuel and Clara once stood, in front of the church that sheltered their secret. Someone produces the original 1920 photograph and holds it up. Then and now, a century between them, but the connection unbroken. Thomas Hayes Jr. looks at the old photograph one more time, at his grandfather's young face, at Samuel's protective hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," he whispers to those long-gone faces. "Thank you for everything." Later that night, Sarah and Marcus visit Samuel and Clara's graves in the church cemetery. The headstones, once neglected, have been restored, cleaned, and surrounded by flowers that descendants plant regularly. "We're naming our first child after them," Sarah says quietly. "Samuel if it's a boy, Clara if it's a girl, so the names continue, so they're never forgotten." Marcus takes her hand. "They won't be forgotten. Their story is part of history now, part of the record." In silence for a moment, honoring the courage that made everything possible. Above them, stars shine over Mississippi, the same stars that shone on Samuel and Clara Johnson in 1920 when they made their impossible choice. The same stars that shine on their descendants now, living the future those two brave souls made possible. A photograph taken in 1920 held a mystery no one could explain. Now, a century later, the mystery has been solved and revealed a story of courage, sacrifice, and love that transcended the cruelest barriers ever erected between human beings. Samuel and Clara Johnson risked everything to save a child who wasn't theirs. They asked nothing in return. They expected no recognition, no reward, no glory. They did it because it was right, because a child needed help, because love demanded it. And now their story will be told forever. A reminder that even in the darkest times, even in the most unjust systems, individual acts of courage and compassion can change the world. The photograph remains in the Smithsonian, viewed by thousands each year, but its true legacy lives in the families Hayes and Johnson, white and black, forever bound by an act of love that refused to recognize the color line. This is the mystery solved, that humanity at its best is stronger than hatred. This is the truth revealed, that love at its core sees no color, only a child who needs saving and the courage to act. Samuel and Clara Johnson are gone, but their legacy lives on in their descendants, in the family they saved, and in everyone who hears their story and chooses to be brave, to be kind, to be love.